And now let us settle ourselves into the service this morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany.
Good morning. I'm Reverend Ann Kadlecek, the minister here, and I welcome you to worship on this beautiful fall Sunday morning. It's good to spend this time together. Today's service is inspired by the Jewish High Holy Days, especially Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which begins at sundown on Friday. In the Jewish tradition, this is a time to repair relationships with ourselves, others, the world, and what we hold sacred. We begin with these words adapted from Leah Ongiri. This is the season of repair, a time to reflect on how we might endure when life tears at us. As our hearts fill with hope and fear, turning and settling, mystery and agency, accountability and acceptance, let us gather today in celebration of our shared humanity and our personal power. Come, let us worship together.
Each week we gather, we light a chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism. Our chalice lighter today is Leah. Thank you. It's okay. It's okay. Please join in saying our chalice lighting words. For every time we make a mistake and we decide to start again, we light this chalice. For every time we are lonely and we let someone be our friend, we light this chalice. For every time we are disappointed and we choose to hope, we light this, our chalice.
And today we light one additional candle as we note tomorrow's one-year anniversary of Hamas invading Israel, killing and kidnapping civilians. We recall this day both for the harm that was done to Israelis and because of the Israeli government's response in Gaza. And we recall this day at a time when the violence has spread to the West Bank, more recently to Yemen, and daily expansion in Lebanon. And now Iran is involved. The history and politics are complex. But as always, it is the people who suffer. We light this candle for all who are hurting in all the ways this last year has brought. And we light this candle for those of us who have the privilege of being able to look away, that we might nonetheless choose to pay attention.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see.
And now we move into our story about the song, Amazing Grace, and the man who wrote it. Portions of this story have been adapted from Heather Forrest's book, Wisdom Tales from Around the World. Amazing Grace is an old song, almost 250 years old. But it's still sung and loved by many today. It's even in our hymnal. And it's performed something like 10 million times every year. Amazing Grace was written by a man named John Newton. Newton was born in London, England, and when he was 11, he left his home and went to sea to learn to be a sailor. He ended up on a slave ship. His job was transporting people who had been kidnapped in Africa to sell them into slavery in the Americas. He didn't think about whether this was right or wrong. It was his job. It's what he did. One day, Newton's ship was caught in a huge storm, like nothing he had ever seen. The masts were ripped off, and the ship was flung from side to side. Even though the whole crew was bailing furiously, the ship was sinking. As Newton bailed, he dimly recalled his early childhood and his mother reading the Bible to him, and he began to pray. The ship made it to shore just barely, and John Newton stepped exhausted onto dry land. He wondered why he had been spared from drowning. Barely surviving that storm began a slow but dramatic change for him, a kind of turning. This was part of the inspiration for the song.
Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home.
Soon after, John Newton became the captain of his own slave ship, where he continued to buy and sell his fellow human beings. But slowly over time, he started to notice the horrors of what he was doing. At first, he responded by treating his captives better than the other slave ship captains did, so not as many died on the journey. But one day, as he gazed at the suffering men, women, and children on his ship, as he stared at the chains and their cramped quarters with no light or fresh air, an intense shame washed over him, like the storm waves in which he had almost drowned. "Turn the ship around," he ordered. "We are going back to Africa." He freed the captives on his ship and returned to England, where he gave up slave trading and became a minister. And 34 years later, he spoke out against slavery. He wrote and published a pamphlet in which he apologized for his role in kidnapping and selling human beings, and for waiting so long to speak out. Telling the world what he had done was embarrassing. But the pamphlet was hugely popular, and within 10 years, slavery was outlawed in Great Britain. He wrote the words to the song Amazing Grace shortly before his pamphlet was published. Heartfelt words about his shipwreck, his coming to see that he had done wrong and had hurt people, and his belief that it was God's grace that had turned him around and saved him.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Thank you, singers, for helping to tell this story. Our reading is entitled On Turning. It's by Rabbi Jack Reamer. I have chosen not to adapt the religious language near the end, but please, as always, mentally translate in whatever way allows you to access the deeper meaning. Now is the time for turning. The leaves are beginning to turn from green to red and orange. The birds are beginning to turn and are heading once more toward the south. The animals are beginning to turn to storing their food for the winter. For leaves, birds, and animals, turning comes instinctively. But for us, turning does not come so easily. It takes an act of will for us to make a turn. It means breaking with old habits. It means admitting that we have been wrong, and this is never easy. It means losing face. It means starting all over again, and this is always painful. It means saying, I'm sorry. It means recognizing that we have the ability to change. These things are hard to do. But unless we turn, we will be trapped forever in yesterday's ways. God, help us to turn from callousness to sensitivity, from hostility to love, from pettiness to purpose, from envy to contentment, from carelessness to discipline, from fear to faith. Turn us around, O God, and turn us toward each other, for in isolation there is no life. So ends the reading. That song, We Return Hashivenu, is a prayer from the Hebrew Bible. It's used in Jewish liturgy. It was set to music by Elena Arian and Noah Aronson. And thank you to the choir and Rich Valdez for sharing it with us. There's a story about Calvin Coolidge, the US president of notoriously few words. His wife was sick one Sunday, so he went to church alone. When she asked him later what the sermon was about, he said, sin. What did the minister say about sin? She asked. Coolidge replied, he was against it. I'm against it too, although sin is not a word I often use. Sin has been used, still is used, to harm people. From the doctrine of original sin, which our Unitarian ancestors flatly rejected, to some of the ways religions wield it to shame and dominate. As with any evocative religious language that has been misused, it can be tempting to avoid it altogether ourselves. But sometimes if we do that, we lose a powerful word that gets our attention and calls us to action and accountability to something beyond ourselves. And sometimes in rejecting a word, we lose an important idea or the ability to learn from other faith traditions that use it. I know there are varying levels of comfort with this here today. We saw this in yesterday's startup workshop. But today I am going to use the word sin as I understand it. For me, sin has nothing to do with violating rules, cultural norms, or religious decrees, or with expectations of obedience. It has nothing to do with judging someone else. For me, sin is about separation from one another, from love, and from what is truest in ourselves and in the universe. Sin is when we act as though we are not interconnected, abuse our power, and create suffering and injustice. Sin, for me, is the actions and inactions that keep the world we have separate from the world of beloved community that we seek. And the deeper sin is when we fail to take responsibility for what we do and don't do. I'm against it. And I do it. We humans are beautiful and inherently worthy, and our sins do not define us, but we do it. We sin as individuals against one another and ourselves, and we sin collectively in what we're doing to our planet, in our exploitation of the least powerful, and tolerance for systems of oppression, in the humanitarian crises, the new ones, and the ones that have been going on so long we've lost track of them. These ongoing sins are causing harm and, in the words of Unitarian Universalist minister Nancy MacDonald Ladd, killing us by 1,000 tiny cuts to the integrity of our own souls. We're against it, but it happens. So what do we do? John Newton, when he realized his sin, first responded by making the conditions for the people he kidnapped a little less appalling. That change probably made him feel good. And it had an impact. Fewer people died. A few years later, the inadequacy of that response became clear, and he left the slave trade altogether. Then his conviction that slavery was wrong sat silently in his soul for 34 years, where it didn't get in the way of his livelihood or his status. By the time he wrote his anti-slavery pamphlet, England was ready for it, even welcomed it. He was kind of a hero. We humans like to distance ourselves from sin. Even if we're aware, we may decide it's not really our responsibility. We minimize the harm, blame someone else, protest that we mean well, or feel so powerless that we just can't think about it at all. Or we do something that makes us feel like we've taken action, might even win us praise, while avoiding actions that would come with a cost. But the Jewish High Holy Days remind us that there is another response available, a healing response. In the language of Yom Kippur, atonement. Atonement is not an apology or judgment or shame. It's accountability. It's noticing the harm we do and setting aside excuses of intent or provocation, confessing our role and making amends, righting the wrong as best we can and turning, working to change ourselves so we don't do it again. Our atonement might help someone that we harmed, or repair a relationship, even inspire forgiveness. But at its core, atonement is a deep religious practice of repair and connection that we do for ourselves, to save our own souls, if you will, from estrangement and isolation. We do it to restore our integrity. The Indian Jesuit priest, Anthony de Mello, speaks of a string connecting each of us to God. When we sin, he says, we cut that string. In alternate language, we cut the connection between ourselves and the sacred, or what we know to be true, or the rest of the interdependent web. When we realize that we've cut the string and atone, then, going back to de Mello's language, God ties the string again, making a knot, and thereby bringing us closer. Again and again we cut the string, he says, and again God reties it. With each knot, our strings become shorter and shorter, and we are drawn closer and closer to God. Whether or not our theology involves a God, for me, this knotted string is atonement. It can't restore what was before, but it can reconnect us, even bring us closer to truth, love, one another, and what matters most. It's a kind of returning to covenant with ourselves and the universe. I don't think I ever thought about atonement until I had children. I lived, as we do now, in a world that values winning over accountability, where people with power and prestige often seem incapable of basic self-reflection, much less atonement. I didn't have models for atonement. I cut strings, and I left them dangling. But when I had children, I was determined to be the very best, kindest, wisest, most loving and caring parent there ever was. I tried. And there were times when I raised my voice, when I didn't give respectful attention to something that mattered to my child, when I was impatient or said hurtful things. I finally had to accept that the best I could do was to own my mistakes, to say something like, "You know that thing I said to you earlier? I should not have said that. That was hurtful and you deserve better. And here's what I'm going to do to make things better now and to change so I do better in the future." Or more often, some highly imperfect variation of that. I didn't call it atonement, but that's what it was. Accountability and repair, bringing me back into relationship with my kids and my integrity. And the spiritual practice of atonement doesn't require perfection. In words attributed to Rumi and sung by the choir here this morning, though you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come, yet again come. Atonement is something we all can do. And in a covenantal community, we have to. What holds us together is a shared understanding of what we value and how we will be with each other and in the world. That shared understanding is as aspirational as my parenting goals. We will always fall short, needing to return over and over to relationship with each other and our shared vision. It's not easy. But part of the power of this kind of community is that here we can practice. For there is no shame in falling short if we then do the work of tying the string, taking responsibility, making amends, and changing. Where it gets a little more challenging is with collective or societal sins like colonialism, slavery, genocide, land theft, exploitation of people and resources, and environmental destruction. This service is inspired by the Jewish High Holy Days. This is not a Jewish community. I am not a rabbi, but I am drawn to a truth about collective atonement that is embedded in the Jewish practice. Ahead of Yom Kippur, Jewish people are encouraged to practice personal atonement in their relationships with others and to make amends. But on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, they have a chance to set things right with God, with the universe. And on Yom Kippur, they do so as a community. The Litany of Atonement that the congregation recites contains a long list of sins. Everyone confesses to them all. It's highly unlikely that any individual has managed to do all those things, but that doesn't matter. Recognizing that their fates are intertwined, the community as one takes responsibility. When it comes to collective sins, this is a powerful practice. None of us created the white supremacy in our society. And if we think solely in individual terms, it seems unfair to expect any of us to atone for it. So we get stuck even as this collective sin continues to kill with 1,000 tiny cuts to the integrity of our soul. But if we come at this from the perspective of healing rather than blaming, and with an awareness of our intertwined futures, and if all of us together as one take responsibility, now we can do something. Atonement begins with acknowledging the harm and our connection to it. It begins there, but it cannot end there. Without some form of restitution and turning, nothing is happening with that cut string, no matter what we say. When those of us who are white say Black Lives Matter or pass the eighth principle and then stop there, that's not atonement yet. Here in New York, just this year, a commission was created to study the long-standing impact of slavery and discrimination and recommend some form of reparations. That would get us closer to healing for us all. And many of our churches are considering their own reparations. That, too, would get us closer. And on the topic of reparations, I refer you to Dr. Alice Green's June 30th sermon from this pulpit, which is on YouTube now. Or consider Indigenous land acknowledgements, which seem to be everywhere these days. We have one, it's in your order of service, an acknowledgement that we gather on land stolen from the Mohican people. Atonement does begin with acknowledgement. But if it ends there, we are in effect saying, what was once yours is now ours. That's language from Alyssa Sobo, Michael Lambert, and Valerie Lambert, who say that what was once yours is now ours could come across more as a painful reminder of an unjust status quo than an attempt to do something about that injustice. Author Graham Wood says that a land acknowledgement is what you give when you have no intention of giving land. I'm not suggesting that we give up our land acknowledgement, but in this month where we focus on our value of justice, and in this week leading up to Indigenous Peoples' Day, I invite us to notice the possibility that it might seduce us into a self-satisfied complacency where, says Wood, it relieves us of the responsibility to think about Indigenous people, at least until the next public event. Atonement asks something of us. I can't tell you exactly what that is in this case, but it's safe to say that if all we're offering is these words, we're not there yet. But perhaps these words can draw us deeper into a process where we ask with curiosity, what might move us closer? Even if it costs us something. Because a failure to atone also has a cost, both for the people who have been wronged and to the integrity of this country, and all of us who have ever benefited from systems of oppression and exploitation. As always, we won't return to what was or what could have been, but we might tie a knot that brings us closer to each other and what matters most. And that is the good news of atonement. At any moment, we can turn toward renewal and healing. And we have this community in which to learn and grow and practice. My invitation for this week is to reflect on the cut strings in our life. Is there one that's ready for a knot? In this season of repair, how might we tie that string and bring some healing to ourselves and to the world? Though you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come, yet again come. May it be so. Amen. Help us to turn, O love, from denial to responsibility, from guilt to action, from fear to faith, and from separation toward each other and all that is true. In this season of repair, let us go forth as one to once again tie the string. As we extinguish our chalice, please join in saying these words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.